Okay, thank you, Rajesh.
Thank you.
I've been asked to make a brief summary, and then we'll have time for about a 30-minute discussion with our speakers this morning. So just to recap, we had 5 speakers this morning. Matt Dougherty covered epidemiology, and some of the points Matt covered pertain to transmission efficiency and how this influences disease outbreaks, and this will be very important for the efficacy of any control measures that we want to implement. Vector abundance affects outbreak severity and the duration of the outbreaks that we should see with these disease-carrying insects. One question that Matt raised for discussion was figuring out what proportion of these beetles that are in the environment are actually infectious, and should they land on a new host, can they initiate fungal infections? Something else I thought was interesting was the vector behavior, orientation to infected hosts, whether they use visual chemical cues and whether healthy or diseased hosts are preferred. And Matt gave 2 examples, one with the glassy-winged sharpshooter, which prefers disease-free hosts, and he contrasted that with peach aphids, which prefer to attack infected hosts. And these different preferences affect disease acquisition and spread in the environment. Host range and diversity affects disease spread, and I think one important concept here was the dilution effect, where diverse communities may have low risk of disease spread because there are just fewer susceptible hosts packed into a small area. Tom Atkinson, he talked to us this morning about ambrosia beetles. Oh, that's not for me. That's not for me. This brought up a bit of a controversial issue, and I think Diana Six was sort of pushing this yesterday, whether these beetles really use or prefer dying or dead hosts versus live hosts. So Tom mentioned that there's about 3,500 species. They have a broad host range. Some are saprophytes, prefer to breed in dead or dying tissues, but other species of these beetles will actually need live hosts to go after. So the other comment that I thought was interesting, and this was touched on yesterday also, was this shift from phloem feeding and a loss of host specificity to attacking the xylem and then using these fungal symbionts, which act as an interface between the host plant and providing the beetles food. So these may be a way of circumventing some of these secondary host plant defenses. I thought that was an interesting point that was brought up too. One thing that's important to keep in mind, that we're not dealing with mass attack beetles. Tom indicated that these are really serial or repeat infestations on susceptible host plants. Some systems may be able to recover from these attacks, so mortality is not always guaranteed following attacks from ambrosia beetles. He made a prediction, and I think Tom Coleman may support this based on what we have heard from Tom's work in the forests, is that perhaps the dominant habitat for these invasive ambrosia beetles are going to be our urban ecosystems where we have a diversity of plants, many of which may be susceptible, and these plants probably don't suffer a lot of water stress, and these may be very good hosts for these beetles. And similarly in the agricultural areas, similarly well maintained and manicured and well looked after plants may also be quite susceptible. The other point that I'll just wrap up with Tom's comments, and I think this is a very important point, there have probably been lots of introductions of invasive ambrosia type beetles into California, but relatively few of them have established here. And that may be because of environmental resistance. They just can't overcome the dry xeric habitat that they first encounter once they get off these supercargo ships which come into the port of LA. Deb Fravel from the USDA indicated that the USDA sets priorities. They often have a 5-year planning cycle, but this is flexible, and should urgent problems like this pop up, there may be, she mentioned, some elbow room to squeeze in some new projects that deemed to be of sufficient urgency. And also her agency liaises with the National Invasive Species Council, which is also an important thing to keep in mind because that's what we're dealing with. Tom Coleman, Forest Service, based over here in San Bernardino, indicated that they have already begun their detection, education and outreach efforts with some collaboration with scientists at UCR as well. He pointed out that the Angeles National Forest is just 5 to 7 kilometres away from some of the nearest infestations that we're seeing in the Arboretum and the Huntington Gardens. So at most risk in these wilderness areas will be coast live oaks, sycamores, willows, white alders, California bay laurel, and these hardwoods tend to be concentrated in riparian areas. So if the need for moisture is important for these beetles, this is where they may attack these native plants in these very fragile habitats. If that happens, the Forest Service will be more interested in dealing with this problem because it will affect the riparian areas and possibly have wildlife impacts. And then finally, Rajesh stepped in to fill in a spot for Gavork, and we heard about an overview of the silkworm production and some of the ambrosia beetle attacks on tea plants. So with that summary, I guess my job is now just to throw it open to the floor and for the speakers to field questions and to get some discussion going on what we heard this morning. So I know there were a few questions where we didn't have time to answer them directly after the talks because of the need to stay on track, because we have a very tight schedule this morning. So questions, please. So, Tom.
This is a question just in general about the wildland-urban interface. I think a lot of us feel that these areas have become so interdigitated that to focus on a problem that's agricultural means that you sort of leave the wildland-urban interface to fester and develop these issues, and that maybe there's a time to perhaps look a little deeper into these issues that are evolving in the interface, and that includes the wildlands and some of the areas I don't think that the USDA has traditionally looked at, particularly from a homeland security perspective. It seems like there ought to be maybe a little bit more attention.
Okay.
Well, as I indicated, USDA is a very large and complex organization, and certainly the Forest Service is part of USDA. From the Agricultural Research Service side, yes, we do look at forests as reservoirs for pests and pathogens, and the most recent example I can think of is the brown marmorated stink bug, is that we had ARS scientists crawling all over forests in West Virginia and Pennsylvania trying to find the overwintering site for the brown marmorated stink bug, and they have found what an attractive tree for an overwintering site is in terms of species and stage of near death and so forth. So yeah, I think you make a very important point that that the forest does need to be looked at as part of the bigger picture.
Tom, do you have any comments on that? The other Tom? Coleman? Yeah.
For Tom Atkinson, you showed that you think it's going to come along the coast, both south and north. We have approximately 15 miles south of where the last find was in Orange County to commercial avocado groves. And really, we're not very far in some sense from the northern side. Can you maybe predict the possibility and the time that it will take to reach such areas from what you've seen the distribution in the urban area?
Well, it's an interesting question asking about timelines, because I heard bandied about the possibility of 10 to 15 years already on the ground. I think one of this map that Richard and Akif did, where they drove all up and down the streets, and the nice points that I showed Akif's map, that it's hard to estimate a rate because this is the first time we have sort of an idea of where it is right now. And so I think what's really going to be critical in the next year, dodging your question, is how much does that map change? So, looking at it right now, it mostly seems to be a single, you could sort of argue this is a single point dispersion from a single source. And possibly the Orange County sites may be, more or less, maybe it wasn't down the streets they followed, so it might still be considered continuous. That San Diego one, that's the, I understand what Akif's disclaimer on that, but, I would still rate that as a positive. So that's the first one where, we actually may see a break from the main part of the distribution. So I was talking to Tim Payne yesterday and thinking about, a lot of times where we were in Huntington and Arcadia, we're still on the western side of the range of hills that separates the inland empire from the coastal area. And, we also get a major difference in heat and humidity. So I think one of the real questions is going to be is when does it make it over the Pomona Hills and how far it goes? So that's one possible stopping point. But then it's also pointed out to me that if you look at Fallbrook, that you basically don't have a high separation and you're sort of continuous. You do get marine layer effects there. So I guess, I really think this is going to be sort of not this year, not next year, but I'd sure like to see this map repeated. So, every 6 months if you really want to start trying to calculate a rate. And then, the question is, at what point is it going to start breaking up and we're starting to get, the sparks flying effect? So I would wonder on maybe the action is I understand the sense of, maybe alerting the public is it going to help or not? But, maybe to the extent that you can slow it by, even if chipping isn't the answer, I think we can agree that chipping won't hurt. So, even if we can't prove that that's the way to go, that it certainly can't hurt and reduces the amount of possible spread. And what we don't want is people, I have no idea where the city of Los Angeles takes its solid waste. So street tree pickup, we don't want them bringing it into Escondido or...
So I have one comment about something I heard yesterday about these surveillance programs that are done for ambrosia beetles. Like we heard about the red bay ambrosia beetle being picked up around the port in Georgia. I was wondering if part of those surveys, do people actually look inside the mycangia to see what types of fungi that these beetles are carrying when they are detected? So that's another thing that really slips under the radar, I guess, and part of this whole puzzle is that we don't realize what types of organisms they're carrying with them or what the pathogenicity of these fungi are until they actually escape out into the environment.
It's based on, the thing is found, is it new, the bell rings, and then it's up to everybody else to say, okay, this is a non-associate, but
Okay.
no, the level of effort and the cost involved.
Oh, it's just too great.
Just attracting the insects.
Yes. Okay.
So I can answer that a little bit as far as the surveys and looking for the fungal associates of these. There's really two trapping programs. There's one that's funded by USDA APHIS, the Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey, CAPS, which does a lot of trapping around the ports. The Forest Service, we have a early detection rapid response trapping program where we put traps sort of in that urban interface just away from the ports. And actually in the past year or so, we funded Ekjiri to look at some of the fungal associates of these new ambrosia beetles that are getting established, especially in the east, but anywhere. So he has a student that'll start looking at trying to get these new ambrosia beetles and look at the fungal associates as soon as we could, as soon as we could find them. So those are the two trapping programs.
Okay, thank you. So I have another question or query out to the guys from the southeast who have dealt with the red bay ambrosia beetle. One of the things we were worried about here in California is when those trees started dying, whether they'd be moved around for firewood, particularly out here for barbecuing. We'd heard that it's a very aromatic wood and people like it to use it for barbecuing. Were any rules or regulations enforced in the southeast to stop the movement of that wood into new areas? And if not, or if so, is there anything that we should be thinking about along those lines for trying to manage this problem while it's concentrated in these urban areas right now?
Yeah, I can probably answer some of that. Previous to the red bay ambrosia beetle, laurel wilt situation, there were no real regulations on the movement of wood products in Florida for the most part. But very soon after this situation developed, they now have some regulations concerning that.
So what are these regulations and how are they enforced?
If you have to have a permit in order to move wood more than 50 miles from the source. And so they're regulating that. It has to be stamped, inspected, shown to be sanitized.
So is this for commercial firewood producers or homeowners as well?
Well, this is mostly for firewood producers, commercial people. Yeah, unfortunately, there are people still selling things along the side of the road or, showing up this way. That's definitely, I'd say, how it moved, probably from Georgia to Florida and then from North Florida to South Florida through infested wood being moved. We had some what we call cool weather for a couple of winters, and people started, burning wood in their fireplaces and things like that. And so you would see wood being sold just helter-skelter.
Okay. Tom, you have a comment on this?
Quick comment. In California, we have a law that says that if you move wood from one location to another, you have to have a bill of sale. And because of the problem with gold-spotted oak borer, we've been trying to get the state to say, well, this should extend to wood which is also being sold once it lands on the ground. Mm-hmm. Technically, this is a law that's in place to protect landowners from having their wood stolen in the Forest Practices Act, but it could easily be just slightly manipulated to say that any firewood that's produced has to have basically a location and the equivalent of saying, where does this wood come from, so that at least a person purchasing the wood would understand it, or if some agent were to go to a wood yard, they would be able to say, did this wood come from an area which has this problem with the ambrosia beetles? So just maybe that's a slight pitch to the people in the room who might think about helping us get the state to take this law from transportation to basically cradle to grave for wood sellers.
Yeah, it is surprising to me that given the well-recognized problem with moving infested firewood around, that there aren't stricter regulations on this stuff, and that they're don't seem to be often enforced. One thing I did hear at one meeting is that regulators were reluctant to enforce these regulations on folks that were moving firewood for potential lawsuits, because they were worried about not only taking the firewood away, but then being sued for the storage of that firewood until the situation was cleared up in court, and then having to return the firewood back to the person should they lose. And they just don't want to deal with that kind of hassle.
So I was going to comment on the firewood situation a little bit too. In Florida, one thing that we found is that, I think this is true in a lot of places other than Florida too, that strict regulation, we're more effective with education and campaigns. And there's a lot of really good educational campaigns out there. There's the Don't Move Firewood program, which is a national program that has all sorts of literature and resources. They've spent a lot of time and effort developing resources that you can use, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people do care. They've done surveys, they've looked, they've done a lot to try to figure out how to get people actually to care, and it seems that that's probably going to be our best approach, because it's just not feasible to inspect every car coming into the state. But also it's important to point out that it's not just firewood, it's also other wood products. In fact, in Florida, we had a big jump in the distribution of laurel wilt a few years ago, and the person who reported the first tree in Volusia County to die was a wood turner. He had collected logs that were just sitting on the side of the road. He knew nothing about laurel wilt, but he brought the logs back to his house, and within a couple of months, a large red bay in his backyard died. He felt bad about it once he found out what was going on, and was educated on it. But we've been actually targeting those audiences as well. So there's a whole organization called the International Wood Collectors Society, and they have meetings around the country, and they actually bring their own sawmill with them, and people can bring wood and cut it there, and they sell wood and exchange wood and things like that. And it's groups like that that need to be educated, and they are, and I think they're taking steps to try to reduce these things. But it's just, I think education is really the key in this situation.
Yeah. So just along those lines, I see another good opportunity for education. If you go to local supermarkets around here, or even gas stations, you see bundles of firewood all packed up, ready to go. Maybe we need flyers and outreach materials at those vendors where people can pick up this information and get it right at the source where they're picking up their firewood.
I'll just go back to Tom Scott's question about national forests. And this as well as anyone, but for everybody else in the room, just for what's potentially going to be susceptible to this host species, and for the hurdles that the National Forest is going to deal with for trying to manage this in these riparian areas. So if you start talking about insecticides, just historically in Southern California, of course, we have a huge hurdle. As soon as we say insecticide, everybody comes out of the woodwork, and we're not allowed to do this. And then you start talking about doing these treatments around riparian areas, that's just going to make it that much worse. So ultimately, I will be really surprised if the National Forest does really take an active approach to this. It's the district ranger, it's the forest supervisor, it's really going to kind of push this type of work, and we'll be there along the way. But until something really good comes along, what you're going to hear is you're going to hear the education aspect of it, and everybody's going to come out of the woodwork and start talking about biocontrol, which, of course, we haven't really heard much about this week. But the National Forest response, I'd say, if it is going to be anything, it's going to be these high-value sites, and it's going to be infested tree removal, which historically hasn't really been that great, or very localized control for some of these situations. But unfortunately, for this valuable habitat that Tom Scott talked about, we just don't really manage that much in it.
Yeah.
But Jason brought up some good points about the education infested material. I'll talk later in the public session about kind of the hurdles you're going to face with to start talking about limiting wood movement.
Yeah, sure.
Right around where we first saw this beetle in LA, there were quite a few nurseries, and I don't think there was one nursery we went to that did not have infected material. We approached the county and LA County, but still the nurseries are not put under quarantine or asked to destroy the trees. And some of them are national type nurseries, and they're sending this stuff all over the place.
Yeah, right.
And how is that going to be slowed down unless some authority tells them that they cannot do this?
Right, that falls under the purview of CDFA, doesn't it? Is that right?
Yeah, we've been having conference calls with the CDFA about this. And there is apparently, quite a complicated scheme where they've got to designate this thing as a particular kind of pest, an A type or B type or Q type or whatever, some type of pest. And even though I think everybody in the CDFA also realizes that this is an important pest, the fact that it's already so widespread within LA County sort of immediately changes its classification. And so then having the nurseries do something about it becomes a lot more difficult, let's say in the regulatory sense. And what the nursery industry also finds is, okay, if we come and tell them, hey, you got these things and it's really terrible, don't send them away, they say, okay, we won't, but what do we do about it so that we can cure these plants? And at this stage, we don't have anything to tell them. And that whole combination of facts, I think, leads to a large inertia in having any kind of action taken.
Right. Yeah.
Did you feel like in your decide what would have feasible work situation in your first?
All right, do we have anything else? But it's because there's no coffee this morning, Ruben. Blame Ruben. Have an avocado.
I just wanted to see if this was for Matt Dougherty. How might differences in host potential for vector reproduction impact the insect vector disease spread and a sanitation control program? If you would comment on that.
Yeah, so I was really focusing on the pathogen disease side of things, but you make a good point that with respect to resistance or tolerance, certain hosts are going to be, they can be problematic for one or two or both reasons, that they're a source of the pathogen, they're a source of the insect, the vector, or both. And obviously, especially if the fungus turns out to not be all that pathogenic, then it's really these surveys and in terms of identifying host strains really need to be focusing obviously on those sort of super spreaders, what we refer to them in disease ecology literature, those hosts that are actually contributing most dramatically to vector populations. And that's a fundamental aspect of any kind of monitoring work for a new pathosystem, is figuring out which of those are contributing to the problem.
So let's bring back to one point Matt brought up in his talk. Do we have any idea as to what percentage of these beetles are infective? And the other point, and this is my own ignorance, is how do these beetles pack their microangia with spores? Is that understood?
All of them are infected.
So they just pick it up?
Yeah.
But do they inoculate themselves? How do they fill up these microangia with material to move around?
They feed on it to start with.
Right.
So the galleries is full of this stuff.
Randy?
They're not all infected, but infested.
not.
But and there's a wide range in CFU. I'm just talking from the Florida perspective. I just got a spreadsheet this morning. Some don't have no CFUs of our fusarium. Some have up to 2,000 or 3,000. There's a wide range, but most of them, if you look at just incidence of those that are infested, it's probably about 90%. And then we see the same thing with Xyloborus globuratus and our pathogen. 0 to about 8,000 CFUs, and those zeros are rare.
Okay.
About 95% of those, 90% of those insects, 85% of those insects are infested with the pathogen.
So how do these microangia get filled? Is that a process of feeding, just walking through the tunnels? Do
Where's
they
Yuri?
groom it
He
into
probably
their
understands
bodies? They
that better
rub
than
it
anyone
in?
else in the room, or Tom maybe. I don't know that it's an active process or a passive one. I don't know how that happens, but man, they are jam-packed with spores.
Right, because I think Jerry yesterday described it as like an apple with, multiple species of these Canidia
zoo.
spores just like all packed in.
Yeah,
So to get them that tight, it can't be that passive, can it? To get them tightly
I think it's just
bound
a
up like
favorable
that.
environment for a lot of different things, and it's not necessarily that it's all nutritional symbionts, it's other stuff as well.
yeah.
You see a lot of yeast, you see a lot of garbage fungi, Bacillomyces. There's a lot of stuff in there.
Right.
It's not one uniform culture.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Well, I have two comments to make. One of them is we keep talking about mortality, and for us, from an avocado perspective, we worry about productivity, and productivity is highly affected even though the tree is not dead. And therefore, we have to look not necessarily how to stop them from dying, but how to stop them from causing the damage that reduces productivity. So what looks as a symptom that we can wait 2 more years till the branch dies could be way into affecting our productivity at that stage. So I really, from my perspective, I don't see how we're gonna figure it out unless we look directly at the avocado level productivity and so on, or any other kind of crop that they. The other one is that the Israelis have had the experience already for quite some time, and we heard from them about what they're going to do in terms of pesticides and fungicide, but they did not really tell us anything about what sanitary and control and recommendation they give to growers.
So is that an open question to Svi and Stanley? I think Ruben wants to know what you guys are doing. What are you recommending to the growers?
Well, my recommendation is good monitoring, good sanitation, and good prevention. First of all, the easiest thing to do, relatively of course, is to protect the avocado area. So the monitoring should focus around the area around the avocado plantations and to try to get rid of every infested tree. There is also always the opportunity to treat newly infested branches or spots. So if you can pinpoint those fresh penetration points, then it's going to be very easy to slow the buildup of the beetle populations. Another thing which is very important is the irrigation issue. I'm going to talk a bit about it in the afternoon. But the plantations which are being irrigated to the minimum necessary are less susceptible to those who enjoy water supply, much water supply, I would say.
Okay. So how do you guys actually monitor for this beetle? Are you putting out traps, or are you just walking around looking for infected trees?
It's much easier to look for the parasital eruptions rather than hanging or suspension traps everywhere.
Yes.
Because the traps, the sticky traps, are covered with filth. There are so many small insects. You need people to look for them. You need to identify the beetle, because there are many, very many little beetles on those sticky panels, and you need a specialist to sort the beetle and to tell the grower what they are. So it's easier to look for the white spots rather than for the beetles.
So you mentioned sanitation. What are you guys doing? Are you chipping stuff, burying it, burning it?
Well, unfortunately, growers don't do much as they should. First of all, you need to treat these hotspots. So in our case, we have plantations or plots which are heavily infested, and sometimes the growers are reluctant to do anything about it. Sometimes it's before harvest, so they are reluctant to use insecticides. Then the flowering season, so they are afraid to somehow to disrupt bee activity. And then later on, they wait for a while, and so somebody will give them the permission or will supply the right formula with what to spray. So actually, most of the people try to delay any activity for the moment. Only now, people realize that something needs to be done, and they begin to somehow to try to do something in an big aerial operation in order to try at least to stop those hotspots to spread or produce more and more beetle to the environment.
Well, Sri, I have a question for you in terms of actually the beetle distribution in Israel. Is it the area that it's infecting continuing to grow? Is it mainly along the coast? Has it spread into the Sea of Galilee yet, or to the Pinkerton growing areas? Where actually is it distributed 100% in the avocado producing areas?
Not yet. The problem in Israel is concentrated in the coastal areas, in the central coastal areas, in a strip of about, I would say, 170 kilometers, with Tel Aviv in the center. Still, 60% of the area is uninfested. And the growers are not, I would say, organized well in order to do the necessary step to slow or to stop the spread. They can do that, but it's eventually much more complicated than simply, take the tractor and start to spray. It's not a constant spread. It's something like jumps. Each time you see the beetle and the syndrome in different areas. So at the moment, it's concentrated in this particular area that I mentioned, but I expect that later on in the fall, we will watch the beetle increase its territories. The question is how fast it's going to do that. It's not always clear. Usually the beetles start to spread when they already exploited much of the resources which are available in a certain area. Well, we don't have good figures for that, but I would assume that within 1 year, they managed to spread more than 50 kilometers.
Oh, wow, really? Okay. All right.
have a question again to Zvi. We have castor beans around our avocados just like you probably have also. Some people are saying, well, you should leave them there as trap plants, and some people say take them all out. What is your recommendation to growers or with respect to castor beans and maybe also box elder?
Well, it's very tedious and difficult to get rid of the castor beans, as you probably know for your own experience. You cut them, you destroy them, they come again very quickly. So it's better to leave them alone and to cover them with insecticides. I think they will be good trap trees. And actually you win twice by simply remove them and cover them with insecticide. The question is with what to cover them. This is another question, because some of the insecticides are very good repellents, and you don't want that. You want them to start to bore in those plants in order to kill themselves. In case of the box elder, is a different thing. The box elder, at least in our area, is extremely sensitive and die very fast. And I would guess that every box elder that will be intercepted by the beetle eventually will be killed. So these three can serve as for monitoring. Well, if you want to look for the beetle in new area, first of all, try to find the box elders, and then you will see whether you have the beetle or not. Secondly, you may also protect these box elders by spray.
You know, the castor beans are not necessarily on my property. They may be on the property of the city or the property of the neighbor. And for me to go with some pesticide and go spray free is going to be pretty risky in terms of legality. How do you convince people to do anything there if it's not on their property?
Yes, that's the issue. That's the major obstacle, I would say, even in our case, because sometimes the castor beans are not far away from the orchards, and people are reluctant to spray them because they belong to somebody else, or they simply don't know how to do that. Or sometimes they don't take the initiative, which they should. For example, I taught several people around here that about a year ago I was traveling with some extension officers, showing them the problem, and we stopped by some pockets of castor bean plants, and these pockets were infested, and about 100 meters away there were some nice avocado orchards which were completely free from the beetle. Just before I left Israel, I got a phone call from one of them, and he told me that you remember those that plantation that we visited last year, now is full with ambrosia. And I said, well, did you treat the castor bean plants? He said, no, the grower didn't do that. And that's the whole story.
So Mary Lou's giving me the sliced throat. I think that's what she's saying. It's time to cut it off. And I guess we'll break now. We'll be back here at 10:20. And it'll give, there's coffee, and it'll give Richard Stouthammer 20 more minutes to prepare this amazing presentation he's going to give. All right, thank you. Oh, okay.